Please welcome Professor Daisy Fancourt.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I want to talk to you about a behavior that I think we are fundamentally undervaluing within our societies. Because whilst we are all bombarded day to day with information about what we can do to live healthier and happier lives, I actually believe that the behavior that we're missing from this list is engaging in the arts. Now, a few centuries ago, this wouldn't have seemed quite so radical. Everybody, even a couple of hundred years ago, sang, danced, told stories. Arts engagement was a part of everyday life. And in fact, if you look at the early writings of every major medical tradition around the world, you see the arts mentioned. However, nowadays, only 1 in 20 adults will say that they engaged in the arts day to day. And we actually now see that arts engagement is increasingly trivialized, seen as a luxury within our societies. So today I want to share with you the new science on this ancient behavior to help us reconsider how we're prioritizing our health behaviors. Arts engagement encompasses a wide range of activities, but essentially we can conceptualize all kinds of arts activities as comprising various ingredients that are beneficial to our health. Some of these, like social interaction, physical activity, cognitive stimulation, we can get from other activities too. But there are some that are particularly strongly expressed in the arts, things like creativity, imagination, multisensory stimulation. And it's this combination of ingredients that we're exposed to through diverse arts activities that actually help to influence psychological, biological, social, and behavioral processes that affect our health outcomes. Back in 2017, I was commissioned by the World Health Organization to undertake a scoping review on how arts engagement leads to health outcomes. I reviewed the findings from 3,500 studies, which aren't even 10% of the overall literature on this field. But they highlighted that there's actually a role that the arts play across the whole spectrum of health and illness. For many of us, we engage in the arts as part of our day-to-day, just as an enjoyable pastime. And this actually has health benefits. But there are also ways that arts can be delivered as part of referral programs or on prescription from clinical care with more specific health outcomes. And there are also clinical programs, including creative arts therapies, that can be integrated with medicine. Now, most people have heard about the arts therapy side of it, but the part that is less well understood scientifically is how those day-to-day behaviors actually influence our health. And it's this I want to focus on today. Over the last 10 years as an epidemiologist, I've been working with my team to understand how these day-to-day arts behaviors influence late health outcomes. For example, using longitudinal cohort data that tracks representative samples of tens of thousands of people over years or decades of their lives, we've been able to demonstrate that when people participate in the arts or go to cultural events or performances, over time, they actually experience reductions in mental distress, improvements in mental functioning, and a wide range of well-being outcomes. Now, you could ask, are these people just healthier or wealthier or have other patterns of healthy lifestyle behaviors? But as a statistical discipline, we spend our time modeling all of the different factors that could confound or influence this behavior, whether they're demographic, behavioral, even genetic. And we actually see that this relationship persists independent of all of those other factors. So recently, working with UK government, we've said, well, can we monetize these well-being outcomes? Because when people have higher levels of well-being, we can actually attach financial value to this. They're less likely to use health services, they're more likely to have enhanced productivity, be able to be employed, access fewer benefits. So looking just at these well-being outcomes alone, we've actually identified that each year in the UK, current rates of arts participation are worth around £15 billion to society. This is an 11-to-1 return on investment from a well-being perspective on its own. But the arts don't just influence well-being, they also play a preventative role in the development of mental health problems. For example, looking at older adults, we've looked at people over the age of 50 who have no history of depression and no current depressive symptoms. We've found that the more regularly people are engaged in arts activities, the lower their risk of developing depression over the following 10 years. So that when we've accounted for confounding factors, it's around half the risk of people developing depression over that period. Again, we can monetize that, and we estimate that this is worth around £1.5 billion preventatively to the UK society each year. These are examples of hundreds of studies that have now been published, not just looking at the UK, but also looking at other countries. My team and I recently harmonized the data from 16 different countries around the world, including across Europe and Asia, and then ran analyses looking at the longitudinal relationship between arts and a whole range of psychological outcomes, meta-analyzing our own findings. And as you can see, we found that there seem to be pretty consistent effects across a range of outcomes, even in quite diverse cultural settings. With a new program grant from the Wellcome Trust as a Discovery Award, we're now launching a 7-year project extending this work to look at 52 countries around the world, particularly considering whether this effect is the same in countries with very different definitions, conceptualizations, and behavioral patterns of engagement in the arts. But as well as supporting us psychologically, there's also a really interesting literature emerging about how arts engagement can support physical health outcomes. Again, through epidemiological research, we've actually found that people who are more regularly engaged in arts and culture have a reduced risk as they get older of developing problems like chronic pain. Notably, the risk reduction that we see, which is around 25% once we've considered other confounders, is actually comparable to the risk reduction from physical activity. But we all talk about physical activity and chronic pain, whereas we don't talk about the arts as regularly. Similarly, thinking about frailty, which encompasses a combination of psychological, cognitive, and behavioral factors, we actually see a similar thing. People who are regularly engaged in the arts have a reduced risk of developing frailty. So an 80-year-old who is not engaged regularly has a 1.3 times increased risk of being frail. And in fact, they also have a slower progression of frailty, even if they do develop it. Ditto for dementia, people who are regularly engaged actually have better preservation of cognition, including things like memory and executive functioning as they get older, and actually a delayed time to the development of symptoms of dementia. Again, we can monetize this, and the values seem to be around £1 billion of benefits financially from this delayed onset. But a big question is, why is this happening? Because for psychological outcomes, it sounds quite sensible and plausible in terms of better emotion regulation, stress, for example. But actually, what we're increasingly discovering from molecular biology is giving us much keener insight into why we see these physical health outcomes from arts engagements. Initially, the molecular biological research on the arts focused on analyzing small panels of biomarkers from cohort studies. My team and I, for example, found in very large-scale panel studies that people with more regular arts engagement have better cardiovascular profiles, they have better metabolic markers, for example, lower levels of blood fats. They also had lower levels of general inflammation in their immune systems, and better neuroendocrine profiles, indicating better stress response. But actually, we've recently started leveraging high-throughput molecular biomarker data that are integrated into cohort studies that mean that we're not just looking at a dozen biomarkers, but we can look at hundreds at once. For example, in recent proteomics analyses, we've actually been identifying which proteins, what the protein signature is of regular arts engagements. And then we've been using bioinformatics approaches to identify which pathways are upregulated from arts engagements. Some of these pathways corroborate what we found both through more traditional methods and also through experiments, for example, downregulation of inflammatory pathways. But we're also discovering new pathways, for example, enhanced cell signaling in the immune system when people are regularly arts engaged. And we're also discovering particular proteins like BCAN, which is a cognitive protein involved in neurogenesis, which help to explain some of those specific outcomes like improvements in cognition and reductions in dementia risk. In fact, colleagues of mine in Chile that we're collaborating with have recently been developing brain clocks that allow us to estimate a person's brain age based on the functional connectivity between regions of the brain that are vulnerable to aging. They've been finding that people who are more regularly engaged in the arts actually have younger brain ages. Their brains are around 5 to 7 years younger than their chronological age. And we've been extending this to consider other kinds of biological clocks that assess other biological systems. For example, using physiological aging clocks that consider a range of phenotypic biomarkers, we found that people who are regularly arts engaged are around 2 years younger physiologically than their chronological age and have a slower pace of physiological aging over the subsequent years. And we've also been able to look at epigenetic clocks, which consider patterns of people's gene expression and look to identify whether people have got particular patterns that indicate a younger epigenetic age. Using this, again, we found that people who are regularly engaged in the arts are younger epigenetically, with the same reduction in age that we actually see from physical activity. again highlighting the extent of the effect sizes that we see from this health behavior. In fact, recently we've managed to link data from cohort studies through to hospital episode statistics and mortality records, and shown that people with regular patterns of arts engagement have a reduced risk of hospitalization for a broad range of different outcomes, and even a longer lifespan. And this is really helping to corroborate the argument that arts engagement is linked in both with our health span and our lifespan. Can you imagine if a pill had this diverse range of health benefits? We'd all be taking it every day. We'd be telling everyone about it and paying premium prices and investing heavily in research and development. But as I alluded to at the beginning, it's actually a very different pattern for arts engagement compared to if it was a pill. It's 80 years since the United Nations declared access to the arts a human right, but it's actually the only UN human right that is not monitored, and we know that it is far from achieved. Not only do we have that figure of 1 in 20 from time use studies that I mentioned earlier, but we also have global data highlighting the inequalities that persist in access to the arts. If we look, for example, at access to arts in education, the number of adolescents who have access to the arts as part of their schooling varies wildly from 30% in Italy to 90% in Korea. We also see that within countries, who has access to the arts is heavily dependent based on their wealth, their education, and other socio-demographic characteristics. Often these are the very same ones that tally with risk factors for health outcomes. Fortunately, though, there is some hope. There are some really exciting initiatives that are developing all around the world that are trying to increase access to the arts, recognizing the fact that it is a form of human capital that has wide-ranging impacts on people's outcomes. For example, we're seeing in Brazil options that provide arts coupons to low-income families. We're also seeing ring-fenced funding within Japan in every infrastructure bill that's now spent on arts and aesthetics. And there are also some really exciting initiatives that are trying to embed the arts more specifically within public health pathways. Arts on prescription, for example, as part of broader social prescribing programs, is now being offered in over 40 countries around the world, meaning clinicians can actively refer people to programs like the arts in recognition of the health benefits that they bring. I'm also the director of the UK's National Centre for Social Prescribing Data and Analysis, because we're the first country to have a full national programme of this embedded within primary care. We've recently been leveraging industry data and electronic health records to actually identify that people who engage in these referrals have improvements in well-being of around 20% just within the first 3 months of that referral. And again, we've been monetizing the return on investment that this brings to these schemes in particular and their funding. And we're also noticing changes in health service utilization in a positive way based on people's referrals. But actually, we're also seeing some new programs like this developing in other countries, more specific to particular conditions. For example, in the last 4 years, I've been collaborating in Greece, where we've been running a series of randomized control trials, looking at people who've got psychiatric diagnoses receiving arts on prescription. Those trials have shown 30% reductions in anxiety and depression within 12 weeks, relative to no change in control groups. And as a result of this, Greece, 3 weeks ago, has passed a new national law, making arts on prescription formally a part of all psychiatric care in the country. And this is just one example of many large-scale policy initiatives that are now developing around the world. Working with WHO and UNESCO, we're now on a roadmap which is trying to launch a series of technical briefings, ultimately ending in a technical resolution that will formally acknowledge arts engagement as a health behavior, just like for physical activity. And this is a really exciting program of work that could actually have influence on the way that policies are designed and arts are funded across a whole range of countries. If we look back over many of the health behaviors that we're now familiar with, each one of them had what I call a seatbelt moment, a tipping point when suddenly there was a sea change in public awareness about that behavior and also in people's behaviors. This is most clearly exemplified through seatbelts, which were not used at all really before the 1990s, but eventually after that body of scientific research and lobbying coming to the fore led to a mass sea change in behavior. But actually we can see this across other health behaviors as well. We only had the first dietary guidelines published in the 1970s. There were still even debates about whether physical activity was good for our health in the 1980s. And I really believe that we're getting to this tipping point in terms of thinking about arts engagement as a health behavior. Really, if we actually flip things around, we shouldn't be arguing that we all need more arts, but actually being concerned about the risk of arts deprivation. Because if you look at the evidence from the other angle, people who don't have access to the arts and don't regularly engage have an increased risk of developing every condition from depression to dementia, chronic pain, and age-related disability. And by not allowing the arts to be evenly distributed within individuals and communities, we are arguably exacerbating health inequalities. And that's why I'm here to propose that we all reconsider the role that the arts have within our day-to-day lives, and we consider as societies whether perhaps we are chronically undervaluing this fundamental and, crucially, enjoyable health behaviour. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daisy. That was absolutely fascinating. We've only got time for literally a couple of questions, but I wanted to ask, from a purely selfish point of view, for my mortality and my brain age, is journalism considered part of the arts, is your mind?
Journalism is certainly often about creative writing, and therefore it's got that cognitive simulation. But unfortunately, once it becomes your professional occupation, we tend to see that it's tempered. So you often do actually have the cognitive benefits, but often you see higher levels of anxiety and depression alongside it.
I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so one thing I did want to ask you is that you say, you've called screen-based activities the ultra-processed foods of the world, and you say that reading fiction has a positive impact on the brain as it teaches how to better navigate the world. What's the difference between reading and watching fiction on screen, like a really good Netflix adaptation or something like that?
There are lots of similarities. So actually, they're both exposing us to narrative art forms, which actually are really important for our brain in honing predictive coding. So the ability of the brain then to respond and imagine scenarios that we might encounter in the real world and hone our predictive response of what we would do if we were in that scenario. But interestingly, when we look at the research studies, we tend to see that the results are more muted when people have received that narrative information via screens compared to reading about it or seeing it performed, for example, in the theatre. And we're still not fully sure why, but I think part of this is to do with the way that screens affect our cognitive processing. So to do with the highly alert but very passive states that our brains get put into compared to when we absorb information through other media.
Fascinating. Please, everyone, thank you so much, Professor Daisy Fancourt.
Thank you.
Thank you.